Now, sex addiction is hardly ever isolated. There are usually other addictions, such as food, work addiction, sometimes alcohol addiction, and often there's depression, anxiety, and constant fatigue. People who struggle with sex addiction are in extreme emotional pain. It's important for us to understand that. They often suffer from deep shame, feeling totally powerless and painfully isolated. It's important to understand that this is not about a lack of willpower. There is a vicious cycle. There's something that causes them stress, a stressor, and that triggers, we talked about triggers in the last presentation, that triggers feelings of pain, fear, and or shame. And then the addict acts out sexually to try to not feel that pain. And whatever the addiction, people don't feel pain during the high or the acting out. But afterwards, the shame intensifies. So then people think, see, I really am a bad, worthless, horrible person. Look what I did again. Moving away from the pain and shame is the motivation for the addictive behavior. To acknowledge the addiction would mean to deal with the pain of the past. There are 3 basic beliefs for people who suffer from sex addiction. The first one is, I'm basically a bad, unworthy person. 2, no one could love me as I am. And 3, I cannot depend on others to meet my needs. Addicts often wear a mask to try to protect themselves from the sense of self-hate and fear. For example, trying to look perfect. And just a note on here as well. The shame really affects relationships, which adds more shame. When people don't differentiate between these 3, they often have a really hard time saying sorry or admitting they've done anything wrong. Because, let's just say someone gets angry and swears at their partner, okay? Instead of saying, I'm sorry that I swore at you, it was wrong, they often say, well, you made me mad, and you made me do this, and you brought this on, because they're not separating this. So they get defensive about their behavior and don't take responsibility for it, which then, of course, negatively affects relationships. Because they think, if I say, I'm sorry I swore, then that means I shouldn't have felt angry, I shouldn't have been tempted to lash out, and I'm a bad, worthless person. They put it all together so they don't say they're sorry. Now, if they separated this out, it would help a lot. Even with their struggle with addictions, they could say, I am never a bad, worthless person. I'm always valuable and loved because God says so. And I don't feel bad for being angry or being tempted to lash out, but I am sorry for swearing. I should not have done that. I should have walked away before I did that. And you see, then you just focus on this, and you can work on anger management, and you can know you're forgiven. Now, the other thing is sometimes people who don't separate these out don't become defensive. They just say, yeah, you know what? I'm sorry I swore. I'm a horrible person. I'm a terrible partner. And I should never feel that way or be tempted to do that. I should never get angry. I'm just a terrible person. And then they become depressed, or they become anxious, or they become enraged. And depression, anxiety, and rage are all a result of shame. Not in every case, but shame produces anxiety in some people, depression in some people, and anger and rage in other people. So again, we need to separate these. So for addicts, if they're not separating this, then it's adding more shame in their relationships and their lives. People who struggle with sex addiction come from families where people were emotionally distant and where there was a failure to bond. In part, the addiction stems from their searching for nurturing without the risk of intimacy or trust. They feel desperate to connect, but because of shame, they're afraid of real intimacy. They objectify people so they can connect sexually without the risk of intimacy, without the risk of feeling rejected for who they are. In addicts, 72% reported physical abuse, 81% reported sexual abuse, and 97% reported emotional abuse growing up. It's very clear that trauma and addiction are connected for the sex addict. Remember, children blame themselves for the failure of their parents or caregivers. They have the magical thinking. So if they're neglected, abused, abandoned, or controlled, where they are not allowed to have their own thoughts or feelings, this results in feelings of shame. Laser says, without exception, sexual addicts are abandonment survivors. Through divorce, death, parental absence, due to some other cause, or merely from the lack of appropriate nurturing, sex addicts have been abandoned. This abandonment, in fact, may be viewed as the energy that fuels the addiction. It is a desperate search for connection that is behind sexually compulsive behavior. Sex addiction is about a search for intimacy. Sex addicts long for nurturance and acceptance. They are lonely and lack true community. In this search for intimacy, sex addiction is a confused spirituality. Much of what sex addicts experience is truly a matter of spiritual longing to be connected with God and with others. Sexual acts with self and others can be an attempt to find this connection, replacing real fellowship with fantasy or symbolic partners. So, to summarize, abandonment fuels shame, and shame fuels addiction. But healthy self-love fuels connection, which is the base or the glue of spirituality. So what is the remedy? How do we get healthy self-love? How do we get away from this shame and false guilt? And how do we experience freedom from all guilt? Well, 12-step programs are often very helpful for addicts. These groups help addicts to connect with God and with people who have the same problem. It is a healing experience, and shame is reduced when people share embarrassing things about themselves and are still accepted by others. Seeing they are not alone with their problem also helps to reduce shame. One goal is to help addicts turn to people in the group instead of addictive behaviors in times of need. People in the 12-step groups can identify with one another, can hold one another accountable, and can provide support in the challenging of false core beliefs. A support system is very important for addicts because loneliness and isolation can trigger relapses. The White Book from Sexaholics Anonymous is an excellent resource and can be found online. It's called The White Book. Only once shame is lifted can people begin to look at their false beliefs and other coping mechanism. Now, some false beliefs for addicts are, sex is my most important need, sex is the best way to get love, sex is love, I only exist or am only valuable if I am sexualized, intensity equals intimacy, and there's other false beliefs. Now, these false beliefs are often subconscious. In other words, the addict often is not in touch with them. But from these false beliefs, you can see that addicts believe that they can exist, be close to someone, and feel loved only through sex. Addicts need to take the risk of learning to truly connect with God and supportive people in non-sexual ways. Once shame is lifted, people can then also begin to work on facing and processing their painful feelings. If people do not grieve their losses, they will seek escape again through the addiction. The cognitive work of challenging shame messages and false beliefs is not enough. Emotions need to be processed because suppressed feelings leak into things such as sexuality and eating. The truth is, if we refuse to honestly face our disappointments and hurts, we are more vulnerable to addictions. I'd like to read to you what the 12 steps are. They're just excellent. So the 12 steps. Number 1, we admitted we were powerless over. It can be food, sex, alcohol, drugs, work, it can be anything. It can be shopping. So we admitted we were powerless over our addiction and that our lives had become unmanageable. Number 2, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Number 3, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Number 4, we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Number 5, we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. That would be dealing with true guilt. Number 6, we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Number 7, we humbly asked God to remove our shortcomings. Number 8, we made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Number 9, we made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Number 10, we continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Number 11, we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. And finally, number 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all our affairs. And that's from the Alcoholics Anonymous book. But these 12 steps apply to all 12-step programs. So addicts need to deal with the shame, not only connected with their present situation with the addiction, but also with the shame connected with the past. In looking at past shame, it is important to separate yourself from what was done to you. If you were neglected or abandoned as a child, you need to know that it was not because of you. It was because of your parents' problems inside of them, problems they likely had because of their own childhood. If you were abused or mistreated, you can feel shame because a shameful thing was done to you. But it's important to separate yourself from what was done to you. The person did or said those things to you because of the problem inside of them, not because you're a bad person. People often think, I'm bad because of the bad things that were done to me. Or I'm bad because people have treated me badly. But God says that you're always valuable and you're always loved by Him, even when you make mistakes. So here you are on this side. This is you over here, valuable and loved. And on the other side, here is the shameful thing or bad thing that was done to you. We need to separate ourselves from what was done to us and deal with false guilt. It is important to have healthy self-love, self-empathy, and a caring relationship with ourselves. It can be helpful to understand the different parts of ourselves in order to do that.